There are certain titles that do not feel like names at all. They feel like fragments of a forgotten world, pieces of something ancient, elegant, and deeply unsettling. Spirit Gorgeous Roux is one of those names. It sounds less like a phrase and more like an invocation, as if it belongs to a presence that should not fully exist in our world, yet somehow lingers at its edges. It carries beauty, but not the comforting kind. It suggests grace, but with something hidden beneath it. Something old. Something wounded. Something watching. And perhaps that is the perfect place to begin. Because if there is one thing history, mythology, and art have taught us, it is that beauty has always had a shadow. The most captivating things are often the ones that disturb us the most. To understand the strange power behind a title like Spirit Gorgeous Roux, you have to let go of the need for simple definitions. This is not a name meant to be explained in a literal way. It is something atmospheric, symbolic, almost ritualistic. It feels like the memory of a figure rather than the figure itself. A presence preserved not in flesh, but in impression. The kind of being that seems to appear only in the half-light, in the corners of old paintings, in abandoned halls, in dreams that are too vivid to forget. There is something theatrical in it, but also sacred, something luxurious, yet decay. And that tension between beauty and ruin is where its true power begins. Imagine, for a moment, a figure standing in silence within a dimly lit chamber, not a monster in the traditional sense, not something crude or grotesque, but something much more unnerving. A presence that appears beautiful at first glance, almost divine in form, but with an aura so heavy that it immediately unsettles the air around it. The face is serene, yet unreadable. The body seems elegant, but impossibly still, as if it belongs more to memory than to life. The atmosphere around this figure is thick with the feeling that it has existed far longer than it should have, surviving through eras, through collapse, through worship and fear alike. That is the kind of energy a title like Spirit Gorgeous Roux evokes. Not just a character, but a symbol of beauty that has outlived innocence. Throughout history, human beings have always been fascinated by this exact kind of image. We are drawn not only to beauty itself, but to beauty when it becomes haunted, when it is touched by loss, by death, by time, by something unnatural. A perfect face in an old portrait becomes more powerful when it feels unreachable. A graceful figure becomes more unforgettable when it carries the suggestion of tragedy. There is something deeply human in this attraction. We do not merely want beauty to be pleasant. We want it to mean something. We want it to carry sorrow, mystery, and danger, because only then does it begin to feel immortal. That is what makes Spirit Gorgeous Roux feel so compelling as an idea. It sounds like the name of a being that is no longer entirely human, but still carries the emotional residue of humanity. A spirit that was once adored, once desired, once perhaps even worshipped, but is now trapped in a state beyond ordinary life. Not dead in the simple sense, but suspended, preserved, elevated into something almost mythic. And yet, beneath that elegance, there is a fracture, a crack in the perfection, the suggestion that what we are looking at is not simply beautiful, but broken in a way that makes it even more hypnotic. This is where the title begins to transform from a phrase into a vision. It stops sounding like language and starts sounding like an atmosphere, a world of candlelight and velvet shadows, of gold that has lost its shine, of marble skin and hollow eyes, of beauty that remains untouched on the surface, while something beneath it has already withered. It belongs to the same emotional world as Gothic cathedrals, faded aristocratic portraits, forgotten ballrooms, and legends whispered through generations. It feels aristocratic, but cursed, sacred, but corrupted, divine, but abandoned. And maybe that is why it lingers in the mind so effectively, because at its core, Spirit Gorgeous Roux seems to represent a contradiction that has always fascinated us. The idea that something can remain beautiful long after it has ceased to be alive in the way we understand life, that elegance can survive destruction, that presence can survive death, that identity can become so refined, so detached from ordinary existence that it no longer belongs to the world of people, but to the world of symbols. This is not simply about a spirit in the supernatural sense. It is about the spirit of something beautiful that should have disappeared, but did not. A memory that refused to decay. A face that still exists somewhere in the architecture of imagination. A ghost, not defined by terror, but by seduction, sorrow, and permanence, and that is often far more disturbing than any obvious horror, because the truly unforgettable things are rarely the ones that scream. They're the ones that remain silent, waiting, and somehow impossible to look away from. In that silence, Spirit Gorgeous Roux becomes more than a title. It becomes an image of survival through transformation, of beauty passing through ruin and emerging stranger, colder, and more powerful than before. Not innocent, not safe, but unforgettable. What gives Spirit Gorgeous Roux its a strange and magnetic force is the way it seems to exist between identities. It does not belong entirely to the living, yet it does not feel fully dead. It is not simply beautiful, yet it is impossible to imagine it without beauty. It is not clearly divine, but it carries the kind of presence that makes ordinary human language feel too weak to contain it. That ambiguity is exactly what makes it powerful. The most haunting figures in mythology, literature, and visual imagination have always been the ones that resist being easily explained. They are not memorable because they are simple. They are memorable because they feel like they come from somewhere deeper than explanation, from a place where symbolism, desire, fear, and memory all begin to merge. If Spirit Gorgeous Roux were imagined as a presence moving through a world, it would not move with chaos or violence. It would move with stillness, that kind of stillness that feels heavier than motion, more unnerving than sound, the kind of stillness that changes the air in a room before anyone even understands why. It would not need to announce itself. It would simply arrive, and everything around it would begin to feel slightly altered, slightly colder, slightly more distant from the world it belonged to just moments before. This is not the energy of a creature. It is the energy of a relic that somehow still breathes, something refined beyond the point of comfort, something too beautiful to feel safe. And that is where the emotional core of this title begins to reveal itself. At the heart of Spirit Gorgeous Roux is not just elegance, but preservation. The unsettling preservation of something that should have faded, but somehow remains untouched. Human beings are naturally disturbed by this idea because we are built to understand beauty as temporary. Youth fades, flesh changes, memory decays, time takes everything eventually. That is part of what gives beauty its emotional power in the first place. We know it cannot last. But what happens when something beautiful does last? What happens when it survives beyond the point where it should have disappeared? That is when beauty stops being comforting and starts becoming uncanny. This is why the image suggested by Spirit Gorgeous Roux feels almost sacred and cursed at the same time. It carries the aura of something preserved too perfectly, not alive in a natural way, but maintained through some deeper force. The face remains untouched. The form remains elegant. The atmosphere remains hypnotic. But underneath it all there is the unmistakable sensation that something essential has already been lost. That what remains is not innocence, not warmth, not human softness, but the shell of those things elevated into something colder and more eternal. It is beauty after emotion has been distilled. Beauty after grief has become architecture. Beauty after the soul has become myth. That transformation is what makes the idea so rich. Because Spirit Gorgeous Roux does not feel like the story of destruction alone. It feels like the story of what comes after destruction, when ruin itself becomes refined into identity. It is the ghost of elegance, but not in the fragile or fragilely romantic sense. It is stronger than that, more severe. More composite. It feels like the final version of something that has already endured suffering, already passed through loss, already been separated from the ordinary world, and has emerged not weaker, but more concentrated, more distilled, more impossible to reach. There is also something deeply theatrical in this image, and that matters. Spirit Gorgeous Roux does not feel accidental. It feels staged by fate itself. Every detail of its imagined world seems deliberate. The dim gold of old light, the rich darkness of empty rooms, the silence of spaces that once held music, conversation, worship, desire. It belongs to a world where decadence and loneliness exist side by side, where grandeur has outlived joy, and where beauty has become so self-contained that it no longer needs anyone to witness it in order to remain powerful. That is one of the most unsettling ideas hidden inside this title. The possibility of beauty that no longer needs love. Beauty that survives entirely on its own, beyond human approval, beyond human touch, beyond human time. And perhaps that is why it feels so unforgettable. Because at its deepest level, Spirit Gorgeous Roux seems to represent something many people feel but rarely know how to express. The fear that what is most beautiful in us may only become fully visible after it has been touched by pain. The fear that elegance is often born not from innocence, but from survival. The fear that what lingers longest is not joy, but the refined shape left behind by sorrow. In that sense, this title is not only about a mysterious spirit, it is about the emotional afterlife of beauty itself. What remains when softness hardens into poise, when longing becomes distance, when warmth becomes atmosphere, when a person, a memory, or a present passes so fully through suffering that it no longer feels entirely human, it becomes more unforgettable than ever before. That is the space Spirit Gorgeous Roux seems to inhabit, not a place of simple horror, but a place of beautiful estrangement. A place where something once alive has become iconic, silent, and permanent. In the end, what makes Spirit Gorgeous Roux so powerful is not that it can be clearly defined, but that it cannot. It remains suspended in the mind like a beautiful enigma, something half remembered and half invented, as though it belongs to a forgotten mythology that never fully disappeared. And perhaps that is exactly why it feels so compelling. Some images do not survive because they are logical. They survive because they touch something older in us, something instinctive, something that responds not to explanation, but to atmosphere. Spirit Gorgeous Roux feels like one of those rare visions. It does not ask to be understood in a literal way. It asks to be felt, and once it is felt, it becomes difficult to shake. At its deepest level, the title seems to speak to one of the oldest obsessions in human imagination, the desire to preserve what is beautiful against time, loss, and decay. Every civilization has expressed this in different forms, through statues, portraits, myths, tombs, rituals, and stories. People have always searched for ways to make beauty survive beyond the life of the body. But there is something inherently unsettling about that desire. Because the moment beauty stops fading, it also stops belonging fully to life. It enters another category altogether, something colder, something more distant, something closer to the sacred, but also closer to the unnatural. That is the exact emotional territory Spirit Gorgeous Roux seems to inhabit. It feels like beauty that has crossed the threshold from living presence into permanent symbol, and that transformation changes everything. What was once merely attractive becomes untouchable. What was once warm becomes iconic. What was once human becomes almost ceremonial. The result is not simply admiration, but fascination mixed with unease. Because we are not only looking at something beautiful, we are looking at something that has survived too well. Something that seems to exist outside the ordinary laws of time and feeling. That is often the hidden core of haunting imagery. It is not always blood, darkness, or violence that unsettles us most. Sometimes it is stillness. Sometimes it is perfection that has become too complete. Sometimes it is the sight of something so composed, so preserved, so emotionally distant that it begins to feel more ghost-like than any obvious specter. This is why Spirit Gorgeous Roux carries such strong gothic energy, not because it relies on obvious horror, but because it belongs to a world where beauty and death have already learned to coexist. A world where silence is more expressive than speech, where memory is more alive than the present, where abandoned elegance becomes more powerful than living joy. In that world, decay is not simply destruction, it is transformation. Ruin becomes style, sorrow becomes atmosphere, loneliness becomes grandeur. And what emerges from that process is not weakness, but a kind of refined immortality. That may be the most haunting idea hidden inside the title. The possibility that some forms of beauty only become unforgettable after they have been touched by loss. That there is a version of elegance born not from innocence, but from endurance. Not from mass, but from surviving what should have destroyed it. In that sense, Spirit Gorgeous Roux does not feel like a simple ghost story. It feels like the emotional shape left behind when beauty passes through suffering and comes out transformed into something colder, stronger, and more permanent than before. Not happier, not softer, but undeniably more powerful. And maybe that is why it resonates so deeply. Because on some level, it mirrors something human. The way pain changes people. The way grief refines them. The way time strips away illusion and leaves behind something more severe. but also more real. There is a reason why the most unforgettable faces in art often carry sadness, why the most memorable atmospheres are often touched by ruin, why what is broken but still standing can feel more beautiful than what was never tested at all. Spirit Gorgeous Roux seems to capture that exact emotional truth. It is not the image of untouched perfection. It is the image of perfection after fracture, beauty after distance, presence after disappearance. And that is what gives it its final power. It does not merely present a figure, a mood, or a symbol. It creates a sensation of encountering something that has already crossed beyond ordinary existence and yet somehow remained. Something elegant enough to seduce, distant enough to unsettle, and mysterious enough to feel eternal. It becomes less like a title and more like a legend. Less like a phrase and more like a presence. The kind of presence that does not need to move, speak, or explain itself in order to dominate the imagination. When all is said and done, Spirit Gorgeous Roux feels like the name of a beauty that has survived too long, suffered too deeply, and become too refined to ever return to ordinary life. It is not innocence. It is not comfort. It is not safety. It is the afterlife of elegance, itself silent, untouched, and impossible to forget.